On a winter night in the Colorado frontier, a penniless cowboy stumbled upon an impossible sight, a wild Mustang, heavy with foal, half buried in the snow and clinging to its last breath. He thought saving her would be his only battle against the storm. But what that wounded mare led him to in the mountains would shatter old legends, unmask powerful enemies, and leave an entire town staring in disbelief. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the Colorado frontier, tearing through the canyons and rattling the bare branches of pine. It was late in the century, sometime in the 1870s, and the mountain town of Dry Creek lay buried under a storm so fierce it erased the world beyond a man's reach. Snow fell in thick sheets, driven sideways, coating roofs, fences, and wagons, until every edge blurred into white. The saloon's swinging doors had been barred, and the lanterns in the windows dimmed, and even the dogs had slunk away into barns and cellars. The streets were empty, scoured clean by ice and silence. For most folks in Dry Creek, a night like this was a death sentence if you dared venture beyond your doorstep. The mountain road that wound its way north toward the pass was especially treacherous, a narrow ribbon clinging to the cliffs slick with frozen mud. Yet, out on that road, rode a solitary figure, tall, lean, wrapped in a weather-beaten duster that did little to keep the cold from gnawing at his bones. His horse's hooves crunched through drifts that reached to the stirrups, each step a labor. His name was Elias Ward, and to the people of Dry Creek, he was a man no one needed to remember. Once Elias had owned a modest spread outside the town, a patch of grassland where he raised cattle and dreamed of carving out a life worth keeping. But debts had piled up, drought had taken its toll, and the land slipped from his hands into the grip of creditors. Now he lived in a sagging shack on the outskirts, patched with boards and tar paper, a place barely fit for the chickens that no longer scratched there. He worked odd jobs, shoeing horses for the blacksmith, hauling hay for ranchers who paid him in coins and pity. People in Dry Creek spoke of him in low voices, often with a crooked grin. Ward was a fool to think he could keep land without money. At the saloon, they laughed at his silence, at the way he nursed a single glass of whiskey, as though it were the only friend left. He carried himself with quiet endurance. His coat was frayed, his boots scuffed, his hat faded by years of sun. His face was lined beyond his 30-odd years, his shoulders wiry but strong. A man who looked as if he had wrestled storms his whole life and lost more than he won. The blizzard clawed at him now, stinging his eyes and stealing his breath, but Elias pressed on. Nights like this, when the world seemed determined to bury every trace of him, he could not shake the thought that perhaps he deserved to be forgotten. As the wind screamed through the canyon, he muttered into the collar of his coat, "Maybe my fate's been buried under this snow all along." He was halfway down the ridge when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind changing pitch, a trick of the gale that had driven men mad before. But then it came again, faint, broken, a sound that did not belong to the storm. A horse. Elias pulled on the reins, and his mount tossed its head nervous. The cry came once more, this time ragged and filled with a pain that cut through the howl of the blizzard. It was not the wild echo of trees snapping nor the groan of ice. It was a living sound, desperate pleading. He hesitated. It could be a trap hunters sometimes used injured animals to lure the unwary. Or it could be nothing more than his weary mind dulled by hunger and whiskey inventing ghosts. Still, something in that cry struck him too deep to ignore. He swung out of the saddle boots, sinking to his ankles in snow, and cupped a hand to his ear. The world fell into a hush between gusts, and in that fragile silence, he heard it once more, the whimper of a horse on the edge of giving up. "Easy, boy. Elias murmured to his own gelding, tethering it to a stunted pine. He narrowed his eyes against the flying snow and moved toward the sound, each step heavier than the last. What he found made his chest tighten. There, half buried in a drift at the base of a twisted pine, lay a mare unlike any he had seen so close. She was a wild mustang, her coat a dark dun now matted with ice and dirt. Her flanks heaved sides swollen with pregnancy. Her back leg was bloodied stiff, bent awkwardly where a wound had festered. And around her neck clung the frayed remains of a rope, chewed nearly through, trailing in the snow, like a noose broken in escape. Her eyes flicked open at his approach, deep brown luminous in the storm's gloom. They were not the eyes of a beast driven mad. They were eyes full of exhaustion, of will stretched thin, yet still refusing to surrender. Elias froze. Wild horses were not known to suffer men near them. They bolted, kicked bit, or died in defiance. Yet this mare only watched him. She did not flinch when he knelt, did not bare her teeth when he reached for the rope. For a long moment, they regarded one another. Two creatures left ragged by life's merciless hand. Elias felt as though he were staring into a mirror, a survivor scarred and unwanted, clinging to the last thread of strength. His breath fogged the frozen air as he whispered, "If you won't give up, then neither will I." He shrugged off his heavy coat and laid it over her trembling body. The mare quivered, her breath clouding the night, but she did not resist. Elias dug into the snow with his bare hands, scraping and heaving until the drift loosened. He braced his shoulder against her flank, straining. "Come on, girl, just a little more," he urged, voice rough with effort. The mare groaned, shifted, and with a violent thrust of will, she lurched free, collapsing onto firmer ground. Elias nearly fell beside her, panting, his fingers raw and burning. He looped the frayed rope, gently coaxing her to rise. She staggered, nearly fell again. But he steadied her, murmuring encouragement until she found balance. Step by agonizing step, he led her back toward the trail. By the time they reached his shack, Elias was near collapse himself. He guided her into the old cattle shed, half-fallen roof, patched with tar paper, and spread a bed of hay scavenged from the loft. He tied the rope loosely to a post, more to keep her steady than to restrain. Then he lit a fire in the iron brazier, its glow chasing the cold shadows back. The mare sank onto the haysides, heaving. Elias sat in the dirt beside her, shivering, the smell of wet hide and smoke thick around them. The storm outside battered the walls, rattling the shutters until it seemed the whole world might cave in. Elias stared at the mare, her eyes half closed, her body quaking, but alive. Alive, because he had chosen not to turn away. He rubbed his hands over the flames, then reached out to stroke her damp mane. "You've weathered worse than this, haven't you, girl? Survived the ropes, the baits, the cold. You made it here." The mare exhaled softly, a weary sigh. Elias leaned back against the stall post, his own body aching from the night's trial. Snowflakes whirled through the cracks in the walls, glowing in the firelight like drifting ash. Beyond them lay a world ready to forget him, a town that had already written his name in dust. But here in this fragile shelter was proof that fate still had work for him. He lowered his voice to a murmur, almost ashamed to say it aloud. "You lived through the storm. You'll carry the name Storm Grace." The mare's ear twitched. She lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. In her eyes flickered something stubborn and unbroken, a spark that mirrored his own. Then she let her head fall back, closing her eyes, as if granting him the right to call her by that name. Elias sat there until the fire dwindled, watching her breathe. For the first time in months, he allowed the corner of his mouth to lift in the ghost of a smile. The storm outside still raged, but in that shed, hope had taken root. The storm had weakened by morning, though the mountains still groaned under its weight. Dry Creek lay wrapped in white silence, the sky a dim pewter sheet. Smoke rose from chimneys here and there, curling into the frozen air. But the town itself moved slowly, its people wary of venturing out until the drifts were cleared. In the ramshackle shed on the edge of the Ward property, a fire sputtered, casting weary light across the form of the wounded Mustang. She lay curled on her side breath, shallow, her swollen belly rising and falling with effort. The Elias had done what he could through the night, but her wounds were beyond his simple hands. If she was to live, she needed more than hay and warmth. Elias knew where he had to go. The forge on the southern edge of town was already alive with sound when Elias arrived, leading his horse through the brittle snow. Sparks leapt from the chimney, and the ringing of iron on iron echoed through the yard. He pushed open the heavy door, blinking against the sudden heat. At the anvil stood Clara Boone, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, auburn hair tied in a rough knot beneath a kerchief. At 25, she was her father's only child, and she bore the work like a badge, calloused hands, smudged cheeks, the smell of smoke in her clothes. She raised the hammer high and brought it down in a clean strike, the iron glowing red beneath her will. Clara Elias called voice hoarse. She glanced up, sweat glinting on her brow. "Ward Lord, you look like death." "What's happened? I need your help," Elias said, stepping closer. "There's a mare wild Mustang. She's hurt bad. Pregnant too. I got her out of the snow last night, but I don't think she'll last if we don't treat her soon." Clara dropped the hammer onto the anvil with a clang. Her eyes sharpened, not with doubt, but with quick calculation. "You brought a wild Mustang into town. I didn't have a choice." She was dying. There was no hesitation in her then. She strode to a shelf lined with jars and bundles, pulling down dried sage leaves, strips of willow bark, and a tin of clean rags. From a cabinet, she fetched a battered kettle and a flask of clear water. "We'll need heat for compresses, a steady hand for the leg, and luck for the rest," she muttered, already moving. Elias followed her back through the snow, his chest easing with each of her determined steps. For the first time since the storm began, he felt he was not carrying the burden alone. By the time they returned, the fire in the brazier had burned low. Elias stoked it higher while Clara knelt beside the mare. The Mustang stirred weakly, ears flicking, but did not rise. Clara set down her supplies, unwrapped the herbs, and poured water into the kettle, holding it close to the flames until steam rose. She dipped a rag, pressed it to the wound on the mare's leg. The Mustang flinched, a soft groan escaping her throat. "Easy, girl," Clara murmured. Her hands were strong, steady. She mixed the herbs into a paste, spread it carefully over the gash, then wound the cloth tight around the leg. The smell of sage and willow filled the shed. "She's been through hell," Clara said under her breath, her brow furrowed. "More than any beast should." Elias crouched on the other side, holding the mare's head against his lap to keep her still. He studied Clara's movements, the patience in her touch. She was no healer by trade, yet she worked with the certainty of someone who had seen wounds before, on men, on animals, on herself. As Clara lifted the mare's mane to check her neck, her face tightened. She pushed the fur back with her fingers, revealing deep grooves cut into the skin. The rope had not only bound her, it had bitten scarred. Clara's jaw clenched. This wasn't some accident in the wild. She traced the marks, then moved lower, pressing gently along the ribs. Her hand paused over a patch of hide where the hair was charred, blackened. "Here. That's a burn." Someone pressed hot iron to her. Elias's stomach turned. He had seen cattle branded before, but this was not the mark of ownership. It was crude, cruel. A scar left in anger, not in practice. Not a storm that did this, Clara said, voice low, furious. Someone tried to break her. Tried and failed. Elias's fists curled until the knuckles ached. The Mustang was more than a stray caught in the snow. She was a survivor of deliberate cruelty, a living symbol of freedom nearly destroyed. He whispered almost to himself, who would dare do this? To a Mustang of all things. The answer came sooner than he expected. Snow crunched outside, followed by the groan of saddle leather. Elias looked up as the shed door creaked open, spilling cold air into the room. A tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat, the Sheriff Abel Harlow. Ward Harlow drawled his voice, a mixture of amusement and disdain. His eyes swept over the scene, the mare bandaged, Clara crouched beside her, Elias crouching low like a supplicant. "What fool's errand are you running now?" Elias stood planting himself between the sheriff and the Mustang. She would have died out there. The sheriff gave a sharp laugh, and maybe she should have. "A horse is property, Ward, nothing more. If it lives, you sell it. If it dies, you bury it. Don't go dressing up beasts with poetry." He nodded toward the mare's belly. "Even if she drops that foal, it'll fetch you a few dollars. Better than starving." Elias felt heat rise in his chest. She's not just any horse. She survived the storm. She's carrying life. That matters. Harlow smirked, tugging his gloves back on. "Always the dreamer, Ward. That's why you've got nothing left but debts and a shack. Don't let wild horses drag you to the grave with them. This town doesn't need more trouble." With that, he swung the door wide, the blizzard's breath rushing in, and then mounted his horse and rode off without another word. The silence he left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Elias sank back onto the hay, his shoulders sagging. He watched the mare tremble, her breath uneven, the firelight catching the whites of her eyes. The sheriff's laughter echoed in his head, gnawing at the fragile hope he had begun to feel. Clara crossed the shed and lowered herself beside him. She rested her elbows on her knees, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. "Horses like this don't come near men unless they have no choice," she said. "Wild ones, they'd sooner die than trust us." "But she came to you, Elias. Limped through the storm, chewed herself free of ropes, and found you." He looked at her, uncertain. Clara turned her eyes alight with conviction. "That's not chance. That's not accident. That's something bigger. You might not believe it yet, but I do." Elias searched her face, saw the fire reflected there, the same fire she carried at the forge. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Maybe fate's testing me one more time," he said quietly. The mare stirred, lifting her head, and gave a soft whicker as if agreeing. The storm picked up again, outside wind rattling the loose boards of the shed, snow hissing against the roof. Inside, though the three of them sat close to the fire, man, woman, and horse, bound not by blood or promise, but by the fragile thread of survival. Elias rested his hand gently on the mare's neck, feeling the warmth through her scarred hide. Clara leaned back against the post, watching the flames. They were no longer just a drifter, a blacksmith's daughter, and a wounded Mustang. They were the beginnings of something unspoken, something fragile, but alive. Elias whispered, his voice almost lost beneath the storm's roar. "If she can make it through this, maybe I've still got a chance too." The mare sighed, the fire crackled, and for the first time in years, Elias Ward believed that hope might not be a lie. The storm broke at last. By morning, the sky was no longer a roiling sheet of gray, but a pale, strained canvas with sunlight struggling through. The peaks around Dry Creek glistened like blades, their ridges buried deep under snow. The valley floor lay in silence, white and endless, the world remade in frost. Elias Ward stood outside the old shed, his breath curling in the frozen air. Behind him, the fire inside crackled faintly, and the mare he had dragged from death's edge the night before lay stretched upon her bed of hay. Storm Grace. She had survived the night, though survival was still fragile. Her eyes, once dull, now held a glimmer of strength. Elias filled a bucket with warm water from the kettle and slid it gently toward her muzzle. She drank slowly, ears flicking at the sound. And when she shifted her weight to rise, Elias steadied her with his hands. She was still weak, her leg bound tight with Clara's careful wrappings. But she stood. For a brief moment, her head lifted high, and Elias felt a swell of pride he had not known in years. "You're tougher than most folks I know," he whispered. She blinked, the sound of her breathing heavy but steady. Elias straightened, pulling his coat tight. Something gnawed at him, something more than hunger or the ache in his limbs. He had found her broken in the storm, tied and scarred. Clara had seen it too. The rope burns the iron mark. None of that belonged to accident or chance. It meant someone had been here before, someone with purpose, and he could not let it go. Clara appeared at the shed door, her cheeks pink from the cold, a scarf tied around her neck. She carried a pouch of herbs and a strip of cloth. "She'll need another dressing this evening," she said, kneeling to check the bandage. Grace allowed her touch, eyes half closing, as Clara smoothed the fur along her flank. When she finished, Clara looked up at Elias. "You're thinking of going back?" He nodded. "Not alone," she insisted. "If someone's setting traps in these mountains, I need you here." Elias interrupted gently. "If she falters, you'll know what to do better than me." Clara hesitated, chewing her lip, then finally nodded. "Don't be a fool, Elias. If you find something, promise me you'll come back." "I will," he said, though his voice carried little certainty. He saddled his rented gelding, a bony creature too old for speed, but steady on the trail. Grace, despite her limp, followed at his side. He tried to send her back, but she would not. She kept pace slow, but determined, as though the mountain itself had called her forward. The climb was long, and the snow crust cracking beneath hooves. The sun broke through the clouds, at times spilling silver light across the slopes, then vanished again, leaving the valley in shadow. Elias guided his horse carefully along the narrow ledge, where the storm had nearly swallowed him whole the night before. It was here, halfway up the ridge, that he stopped. Beneath the packed snow, faint but undeniable, two deep grooves ran parallel. Elias dismounted, crouched low, and brushed the surface with his glove. Wagon tracks. The impressions had hardened under ice, but their shape was clear wheels, heavy ones, pressed deep enough to tell of a loaded bed. No settler would have hauled supplies up here in such weather. No traveler would have risked these cliffs in the heart of a storm. Whoever drove that wagon had a purpose. Elias traced the grooves with his fingers, his breath fogging. He muttered under his breath, "Someone came up here in the blizzard." And it wasn't by chance. Grace snorted softly behind him, stamping her hoof. Elias looked back, his jaw tightening. Whoever had hunted her had not been working alone. He followed the tracks a short distance farther, leading both horses through the knee-deep snow. After a dozen yards, something metallic gleamed beneath a drift. Elias kicked at it, and the snow slid away to reveal the jagged jaws of an iron trap. It was wide, with teeth sharp as knives, the kind meant to hold a beast heavy and strong. He bent, lifting it, and felt its brutal weight strain his arms. Blood stained the rusting metal dark against the frost. His chest hardened with rage. Grace's wound. She must have stepped into this very snare, felt it clamp on her legs, struggled until flesh tore. And somehow, through sheer defiance, she had ripped free. Elias hurled the trap aside, the clang echoing through the canyon. "They hunted you, girl," he said, turning to Grace. "And not just you." She lowered her head, ears twitching as if she understood. Elias stroked her neck, feeling the roughness of her scar. "You fought to get away. Now we'll fight to know why." The tracks pressed deeper into his mind than the snow ever could. This was no lone hunter's doing. It was organized. Farther along the trail opened into a hollow at the edge of a pine thicket. Trees bent under the weight of ice, their branches snapping. Among them, Elias saw wood timbers lashed crudely together, now broken and half buried in snow. He pushed closer, brushing the drifts aside. It had been a pen small but sturdy, built to hold animals for a time. Not livestock, its beams were too roughly cut, its corners braced with iron spikes instead of joinery. This was no settler's handiwork. It was a holding cage raised in secret, meant to contain wild things until they could be hauled away. Strands of rope clung to the posts, frayed and frozen. In the snow, he found tufts of horsehair dark against the white. He lifted them in his palm, his breath catching. "This is where they kept them," he murmured. "Corralled them before loading the wagons." The thought struck like lightning. Grace was not alone. She had broken free, but the others like her might still be in chains. The shed silenced the sheriff's laughter. Clara's words all collided in his mind. The storm had not merely spared one life. It had delivered him into something far larger. He stood there staring at the ruin of the pen when a sharp sound broke the air. A hoof striking ice. Elias turned. Grace had moved from the trail, her head lifted toward the ridge to the west. She pawed the ground, stamping again, her eyes fixed on the distant line of trees. "You see something?" Elias said softly. She stamped once more, then started forward, limping but insistent. Elias caught her lead rope, hesitated, then let it fall slack. He studied her for a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat. "All right, girl," he whispered. "I'll follow." He mounted his gelding and let Grace take the lead. The tracks, the traps, the broken corral, every clue pointed to a hand behind the storm. And Grace, scarred but unbroken, was guiding him toward the heart of it. The sun dipped lower shadows, lengthening across the snow. Somewhere beyond the ridge, answers waited, and Elias Ward felt the weight of them pressing close. The trail west of town followed the frozen creek until the water disappeared under a sheath of ice. Elias rode with his collar turned high, the gelding plodding through snowdrifts, Storm Grace limping steadily behind. The air carried no bird song, no chatter of life, only the groan of the mountains shifting under winter's grip. By mid-afternoon, the cabin came into view, a crooked silhouette leaning against the slope, smoke seeping from a stone chimney. The place looked as though a strong wind might finish it off. Its roof sagged under ice shutters, hung uneven, and the yard was littered with rusted tools. Yet Elias felt something stir in his chest as he dismounted. He had come seeking a man who carried more memory than most townsfolk wanted to believe. Ezekiel Whitaker had once been a name spoken with respect across 3 counties. In his prime, he rode with cattle drives, broke mustangs on open ranges, and led hunting parties through the canyons where few men dared go. But that was decades ago. Age had bent him. His frame was gaunt, his beard long and tangled like silver moss. His eyes, though dulled by time, still caught light with sudden flashes. He lived alone in the cabin by the creek, surrounded by relics. Saddles with cracked leather hung from the beams. A rifle, its barrel pitted with rust, leaned by the door. On a shelf above the hearth were photographs so faded the faces were ghosts. To townsfolk, he was the old fool by the creek, a hermit best avoided. But anyone who had tracked elk or driven herds through storms knew the truth. Whitaker understood these mountains like no one else alive. Elias tied his horse and knocked on the crooked door. The door creaked open, revealing Whitaker wrapped in a patched coat, a wool cap pulled low. His brows rose at the sight of Elias, but when his gaze slid past him and landed on the Mustang, his posture stiffened. "Well, I'll be damned," Whitaker muttered. His voice rasped like gravel dragged across wood. He stepped onto the stoop, eyes narrowing at Grace. "It's been a long time since I saw one like her." "She barely made it through the storm," Elias said. "Pregnant, hurt bad. I pulled her out of the snow up by the ridge." Whitaker's gaze lingered on the scars around her neck, the limp in her step. Something unreadable passed over his face. Part sorrow, part recognition. "Come inside before the cold kills us all," he said at last. The cabin smelled of smoke and bitter coffee. Whitaker stirred the embers in the stove, tossed in a log, and poured 2 tin cups of black brew that tasted like burnt earth. He settled into a chair opposite Elias, the firelight casting shadows across the hollows of his face. "What is it you've come to ask, boy?" he said. Elias leaned forward. "I found traps, a wagon's tracks, a wooden pen half buried in snow. Someone's hunting out there." "Do you know who?" Whitaker did not answer right away. He sipped his coffee, staring at the flames as if they could speak. Then he exhaled long and weary. "Long before this town was more than a saloon and a prayer," Whitaker began. "There was a valley east of here. Silver Hollow, we called it. A place the sun touched different. Grass stayed green even when frost swallowed the plains. Streams ran clear when others dried. And in that valley lived a herd of mustangs, the likes of which you've never seen." Elias listened silent, his cup cooling in his hands. "Hundreds of them," Whitaker continued, "wild as thunder, fast as lightning. Stallions with manes like fire mares, strong enough to carry a man 50 miles without breaking. Folks swore they were spirits sent by God, guardians of freedom itself. And then men got greedy." His eyes hardened. "They came with ropes, rifles, wagons, drove the herds into traps, sold them by the dozens, some to the army, some to the pits. By the end of that bloody decade, people said the herd was gone, extinct." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "But I don't believe that. I've seen signs over the years, tracks too many for stray silhouettes moving on ridges where no horse should be. They didn't vanish. They hid. Silver Hollow's their refuge, a place men can't find unless the herd allows it." Elias frowned. "You're saying they're still out there?" Whitaker's gaze shifted to Grace, who stood outside the frosted window, her breath fogging the glass. "You've already met proof. That mare didn't just stumble to your door. She let herself there. She chose you." Elias shook his head. "I don't see why." "Because signs aren't given to men who won't bear them," Whitaker said flatly. "You're part of it now, whether you want to be or not." The words sank into Elias like embers pressed to skin, painful, but awakening something. Part of him resisted. Legends were for children and drunks. But another part, the part that had carried Grace through the storm, stirred with hope. Whitaker set his cup down, his tone turning sharp. "If Grace came to you, that's a calling. But don't mistake it for luck. The men who set those traps will not stop. Not now." "Who are they?" Elias asked. The old man's mouth twisted. "Horace Van Dorn, you know the name." Elias's jaw tightened. Everyone in Dry Creek knew. Van Dorn owned the largest ranch in the county, a man with money cattle and men enough to enforce his will. He's been after mustangs for years, Whitaker said. Paid hunters to rope them, cage them, ship them east. The army buys strong backs and fast legs, and the ones that don't sell end up broken in pits, made to fight until they're nothing but hide and blood. Van Dorn lines his pockets, pretends it's all business. Elias's fists clenched. He thought of the trap, the blood, the broken corral. Thought of the sheriff's mocking words. Suddenly, it all wove together. Those tracks you saw, those pens, they're his men's work, Whitaker said. And if they catch wind that you've got one of their strays, they'll come knocking, with more than rope. The fire popped sharply, sending sparks up the chimney. Whitaker's eyes glowed in the reflection. You'd best decide now whether you're ready to fight. Because there's no middle road. Either you protect her or you let them take her. And if they take her, the rest of the herd won't stand a chance. When Elias stepped back into the cold dusk, it already bled across the mountains. The air bit sharper than before, as if the world itself had teeth. Grace stood waiting near the creek, her ears twitching, her breath a plume of white. He paused, staring at her. She gazed back, unblinking eyes, catching the faint light like polished amber. In them he saw no fear, no surrender, only endurance. Whitaker's words echoed in his skull. A calling. Van Dorn won't stop, either protect her or lose them all. Elias pulled his coat tighter, his hands trembling. Legends were stories told to give drifters hope. But what if this one was real? What if Silver Hollow still breathed with pounding hooves? He laid a hand on Grace's neck. Her muscles trembled, but she stood steady, her ears angled toward him, as though awaiting an answer. I don't know if the old man's right, Elias whispered. But I won't let them touch you. Not you. Not any of them. Grace flicked her tail, pawed once at the snow, and lifted her head high. For the first time in years, Elias Ward felt a decision settle into his bones. Doubt lingered, but beneath it burned a new resolve. The storm returned that night. Wind slammed against the shack, rattling loose boards and driving snow through every crack. The mountains moaned as if the earth itself had turned restless, and the pines bent low, their branches groaning under the weight of ice. Elias sat by the brazier, feeding the fire with scraps of wood, when he noticed the mare begin to shift. Storm Grace had been uneasy all evening, rising and circling her stall, then dropping heavily onto the straw only to lurch back up again. Now her breathing came in ragged bursts, her flanks trembling, her belly contracting. She staggered once, nearly falling, and Elias rushed forward, catching her head in his arms. Easy, girl. Easy, he whispered. But he knew. He had seen this before, long ago on his father's ranch, when foals were born under calmer skies. Grace was in labor. Panic struck him like a blow. He was no midwife, no seasoned hand. He could not do this alone. Without a second thought, Elias threw on his coat and pushed into the blizzard. Snow bit his face like shards of glass as he trudged down the path to town boots, sinking knee-deep with every step. He reached Clara Boone's forge and pounded on the door until his knuckles stung. The door flew open, and Clara, wrapped in a heavy shawl, blinked against the snow. Elias, what in God's name? She's starting. Elias gasped. The mare. Grace. The foal's coming now. Clara's expression changed instantly from confusion to fierce focus. She grabbed a bundle of blankets, a kettle, a flask of water, and a small knife she quickly held over the forge flame to sterilize. Led the way, she said. Together they fought their way back through the gale, their lanterns barely cutting through the snow. By the time they stumbled into the shed, Elias's face burned raw, and Clara's hands were stiff from the cold. But they had made it in time. Inside, the air smelled of sweat, straw, and smoke. Grace lay trembling, her ears pinned, her sides heaving. Her eyes rolled white as she kicked at the ground, the contractions tearing through her body. Elias knelt by her head, stroking her damp mane. "You're not alone," he murmured. "I'm here. We're both here." Clara moved quickly, spreading blankets, heating water in the kettle, readying clean rags. Her voice was calm but firm. "Keep her steady, Elias. Talk to her. She needs to know she's safe." Outside, the wind howled, battering the walls, each gust a reminder of the storm's merciless presence. Inside, the world narrowed to the circle of lamplight, the trembling mare, and the two humans kneeling in devotion. Grace screamed, a raw, guttural sound that cut Elias to the marrow. She strained legs, thrashing, then collapsed with a shudder. Elias held her head against his chest, whispering encouragement, while Clara worked at her flank. "It's coming," Clara said. "Hold her. Just hold her." The minutes stretched into eternity. Then, with a final convulsion, a small, slick body slid onto the straw. A foal, shivering legs, sprawled awkwardly, its coat wet and matted. Clara seized a rag, wiping the newborn clean, but Grace pushed her aside with surprising strength. The mare lowered her head, licking the foal with fierce urgency, clearing its nostrils, urging it to breathe. The foal gasped, then let out a weak whinny that pierced the shed like a bell. Elias felt tears sting his eyes. Clara exhaled a shaky laugh. There it is, alive, strong. Grace continued her work, her eyes glowing with pride, even as her body trembled with exhaustion. She curled herself around the foal, her breath washing over its fragile frame. Elias sat frozen, his heart thundering. In that dim stall, amid the stench of blood and straw, he saw more than birth. He saw renewal, hope raw and undeniable, kicking its way into the world. He slumped against the stall wall, his hands trembling. For years he had carried only loss, his land gone, his pride trampled, his name scorned. He had wandered like a ghost through Dry Creek, living but never alive. But now in the firelight, a new life shuddered into existence. Grace had endured rope iron, storm, and pain, yet she had not given in. And now she gave the world something untamed and free. Elias's throat tightened. He reached out, touching the foal's damp coat, and whispered, "If you can start over, maybe I can too." Tears slid down his cheeks, hot against the winter's cold. Clara, kneeling across from him, watched quietly. Her eyes softened, though she said nothing. She didn't need to. She understood. The moment of peace did not last. Grace suddenly lifted her head, ears, rigid nostrils flaring. A low growl rose in her chest, more primal than any horse should make. She stood protectively over her full muscles, quivering eyes locked on the door. "What is it?" Elias whispered, rising to his feet. He grabbed the lantern and pushed the door open. Snow still fell, muting the world in white. But across the yard near the tree line, Elias saw them footprints. Deep impressions in the snow, too large and too fresh to be old. They led from the forest straight to the shed, then turned back. His pulse hammered. Someone had been here watching while they had been bent over Grace's struggle. He swung the lantern high, scanning the shadows, but the intruder was gone. Only the storm remained, covering the tracks inch by inch. Elias returned inside, his jaw clenched. Clara looked at his face and knew before he spoke. There were footprints, he said. Fresh. Clara's face drained of color. She glanced at Grace, still standing guard over her foal, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "They'll come back," Clara whispered. "And not just for her." They'll want the foal too. Elias's hand curled into a fist. Whitaker's warning roared back in his memory: Van Dorn, the hunters, the traps, the shadow circling closer with every step. He stared toward the forest, his breath hot in the freezing air. Whoever had come tonight would come again. And next time, they wouldn't turn back. In the stall, Grace lowered herself beside the foal, her body curling protectively, her breath harsh but steady. Her eyes never left the door. Elias stood over them, lantern in hand, the storm shrieking outside. "Whoever you are," he muttered, his voice low and fierce, "you won't take this from me. Not her, not the foal, not now." The wind answered with a howl that shook the rafters, a promise of trials still to come. The storm broke 3 days after the foal's birth. The sky cleared to a brittle blue sunlight, scattering across the snow like shattered glass. Dry Creek emerged slowly from the grip of winter, its people shoveling paths, its chimneys coughing smoke. But Elias Ward's world had narrowed to the shed on the edge of town, where Storm Grace and her foal rested in the straw. The foal grew stronger with each passing hour, its legs still wobbly but gaining confidence. Grace never strayed far from its side, her body curling around it at night like a shield. Elias and Clara watched with quiet awe, still shaken by the footprints they had found in the snow. The hunters were near. Whitaker's warning echoed in Elias's thoughts with every breath. Then one morning, as dawn burned faint gold across the horizon, Grace lifted her head and let out a cry unlike any Elias had heard before. It was long, piercing, and insistent, an announcement to the mountains. She turned her eyes, locking on the eastern ridge, ears pricked, muscles quivering. Elias felt it. Instantly, she wanted to go. He strapped on his old rifle, slung a pouch of dried bread and jerky across his back, and tightened the cinch on his gelding saddle. Clara watched from the doorway, her face pale beneath her scarf. "You don't have to go," she said. "Yes, I do," Elias replied. He adjusted his hat against the glare. "She's leading me somewhere. If I turn back now, I'll never know why she came to me." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I'll keep watch on the foal. But be careful, Elias. If they followed her once, they'll follow again." He gave her a faint smile, one that carried more weight than hope. "I'll come back." And so he rode out with Grace, limping but determined at his side. Her scars glistened faintly in the morning sun, each step steady, purposeful. The gelding snorted uneasy, but Elias urged him forward. The path wound through black pines, heavy with snow, then climbed the frozen slope where wind cut like knives. Elias's breath fogged in the air, his hands numb on the reins, but Grace pressed on her ears forward, hooves biting into the crust as if she knew each turn. From a distance, the image would have been stark, a gaunt cowboy in a weathered coat and a scarred Mustang striding side by side, their silhouettes etched against the white spine of the mountains. It looked less like chance and more like destiny carved in motion. By midday, they reached a narrow cleft between two cliffs. The rocks loomed high, jagged like the teeth of a trap, but Grace showed no fear. She slipped into the gap, Elias close behind. The passage twisted sharply, and then the world changed. Elias drew a sharp breath as the canyon opened into a vast bowl of land, hidden between peaks. Silver Hollow. It was nothing like the barren snowscapes they had left behind. Here grass rolled in lush swathes, emerald against the frost. Streams glittered as they wound through the meadow, their waters untouched by ice. Sunlight struck the high ridges and spilled silver light down the slopes, painting the valley with a glow that seemed almost holy. Birds wheeled overhead, their wings flashing. And then came the sound, a thunder of hooves. From the far side of the valley, they appeared cresting a rise in a storm of motion mustangs, dozens upon dozens, flowing like a river of muscle and wind. Their manes streamed, their coats gleamed in every shade, chestnut, dun, black, and white. They surged across the meadow with such force the ground trembled, circling in formation, their cries rising in unison. Elias's heart hammered. His throat went dry. He had heard Whitaker's stories of the whispers of a hidden herd, but to see it alive, unbroken, glorious, was like staring at a dream made flesh. "Lord Almighty," he whispered. "It's real. The legend's real." Grace whinnied in reply, lifting her head high. Some of the herd turned toward her, their ears flicking, their cries answering hers. She stepped forward, proud, despite her limp announcing her return. But their eyes, sharp, watchful, remained fixed on Elias as well. Not fearful, not hostile, but wary. He was the intruder here, tolerated only because of the mare at his side. Elias removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I mean no harm," he murmured. "Not to you, not to any of you." The wind carried his words across the hollow, swallowed by the rhythm of hooves. A glimmer of joy flared in Elias's chest, but it soured quickly. As he guided Grace along the valley's edge, his eyes caught something half hidden in the brush steel glinting under snow. A trap. New. Its jaws wide, teeth sharp, its spring still oiled. Beside it, the snow was churned with mud, as though men had struggled to set it in place not long ago. Elias's pulse quickened. He moved farther, scanning the ground, and found more tracks pressed deep by wagon wheels, still crisp in the frost. Heavy loads had been dragged here. His stomach turned. The hunters had already breached the hollow. The herd was not safe. He stroked Grace's mane, whispering, "We came too late. But maybe not too late to stop them." Grace tossed her head, her ears pricked to the east. Elias followed her gaze and froze. Riders emerged from the slope beyond the meadow, their figures stark against the snow. 6 in all. At their head rode a broad-shouldered man in a deerskin coat, his hat casting his face in shadow. Horace Van Dorn. Elias's gut clenched. He had seen Van Dorn in town often enough, swaggering into the saloon's silver watch on his vest, speaking like the land itself bent to him. But here in the hollow, he looked more like a general than a rancher. Beside him rode a taller man, built like an ox, his beard black, his eyes pale and hard as iron. Jonah Pike. A name whispered in saloons from Cheyenne to Santa Fe. A man who made his living breaking wild horses, crushing their spirit until they bent or bled. Behind them followed armed riders, ropes, coiled rifles, slung steel traps strapped to their saddles. Van Dorn reined in his horse, his eyes sweeping the valley. When they landed on the herd, he smiled a predator's smile. "Well, Ward," he called, his voice carrying across the meadow. "Isn't this a stroke of fortune? You stumble upon a secret I've hunted for years. But don't worry. I'll make good use of it." Elias raised his rifle, though his hands trembled. "They don't belong to you, Van Dorn. Not one of them." Van Dorn chuckled deep and rich. "Everything that runs on this land belongs to me. Soon enough, each of those beauties will wear my brand, even your scarred mare if she's still worth breeding." Jonah Pike spat into the snow. His voice was gravel. "We'll round them up before spring. Don't stand in the way, Ward. You won't like how it ends." Elias's jaw tightened. He had faced storms, hunger, ridicule, but never men with this much power arrayed against him. Grace stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and the riders. She snorted, her eyes blazing, her call ringing across the valley like a challenge. Elias felt something shift inside him, a steel that had lain dormant for too long. He lowered his rifle just enough to speak, his voice low, but steady. "If this is the reason she came to me," he said, "then I won't turn away." The valley seemed to hold its breath. Then from deep within the hollow came the answer, the thunder of hooves. The herd surged again, their cries rising, a storm of living power gathering for the fight that would decide their fate. Elias gripped his rifle, his heart pounding. Whatever came next, he knew he would not yield. The wind slid low across Silver Hollow like a warning. Elias could feel it in his bones as he stood at the rim of the valley eyes, scanning the white plains and rippling grass, listening for the change in sound that meant riders. Grace stood beside him, her breath steaming her scars, pale in the winter light. Far across the hollow, the herd milled in a wide crescent, restless as a storm-tossed sea. Word had traveled the way it always did in a small town, quiet and quick. By dusk that same day, shapes emerged from the tree line on the northern slope. Not hunters, but neighbors. Tom Tilson, whose hands were more used to fence posts than rifles. Maeve and Harlan Price, farmers who had lost 2 geldings to rustlers last fall and never forgot the ache of an empty gate. Old Juniper Bill, who trapped in the high country but drew the line at Iron Teeth, meant for a Mustang's leg. And Clara Boone, hair tied tight, soot smudged along her jaw, a hammer looped through her belt like a sidearm. They came without ceremony, no flags, no speeches, just the blunt spirit of people who had decided enough was enough. Elias met each in turn, measuring their faces, nodding his thanks until it hurt to swallow. "Keep the fires going along the ridge," he told them, pointing where the valley pinched narrow. "Light scares the horses less than metal. Stack brush and green wood. Smoke will carry. If they try to ride in after dark, they'll ride blind." Harlan frowned at the empty horizons. "We're short on guns. We're rich in ground," Elias said. "This place favors what runs. Pen them in the basin until we give them a road to the prairie. The herd's too big to steal whole if we hold the choke points." Clara pushed past the men and planted a boot against a fallen fir, levering it into place to make a waist-high barricade. "We build here and here," she said, chin jutting toward 2 narrow swales. "Nothing fancy. Just enough noise and trouble to turn a horse from a trap." Elias looked at her, and for a breath, the white world felt warm. "You don't have to be here." She shot him a look fierce and unapologetic. "This is the only chance we'll ever get. If the herd disappears, Dry Creek loses its soul." By nightfall, rough barricades stitched the valley's seams, logs tumbled together, thorn brush dragged from creek beds, stakes pounded fast with the flatbacks of axes. Fires prickled along the ridges, their smoke coiling upward like black ropes. The work was ugly and imperfect, but it was human, which meant it was stubborn. When the moon rose thin and rhymed, Grace lifted her head. She stepped to the front of the basin and faced the herd. There was a space around her, a hush that moved with her like a shadow. Then she sounded a cry so clear it might have been pulled from the high strings of the sky. The reply came in waves. A stallion trumpeted from the far side. Mares tossed their manes and answered, hooves stamping in place. The herd closed ranks. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, a living braid of muscle and breath. They did not bolt. They did not scatter. They aligned one mind, as if the valley itself had taught them how to be more than many. Elias felt the hairs rise on his arms. He knew horseflesh and hard work and the beautiful stubborn math of survival. But this was something beyond bone. He leaned toward Grace and whispered, "You are the wind, and I'll be your shadow." Dawn leaked into the basin with a faint lemon light. The fires had burned low to coals. Frost smoked off the grass. Elias was tightening the cinch on his gelding when a sound slid through the morning, a sharp metallic squeal, the click of spring and tooth. "Traps," Clara said, eyes narrowing. They found the first along the west slope, neatly hidden under a veil of snow. Then another. Then a row of 3 jaws, yawning, iron-oiled and hungry. Jonah Pike's calling card. Elias waved Tom and Harlan back, eased a long branch into the first jaw, and sprang it with a crack that echoed off stone. Before the echo died, a man's voice rang out across the rocks. "Careful there, Ward. Hate to see you lose a hand before breakfast." Jonah Pike stepped from behind a shoulder of granite with 2 men at his back, each leading a horse piled with rope and iron. Pike's beard was flecked with ice. His eyes were not. He wore confidence like a second coat, heavy and mean. He sauntered closer, the coil of a lariat brushing his thigh. "You can't choke a river," Elias said. "And you can't trap a storm. Storms break," Pike said. "That's what they do." He flicked his wrist. The lupus unfurled with practiced grace, sliding through the air. Elias ducked. The rope slapped stone where his neck had been. He lunged, closing the distance, and slammed Pike into the boulder with his shoulder. The 2 men hit the ground in a sprawl of snow and curses. Pike was stronger, anvil-built, and mean. And he fought like a smithy's hammer, straight, brutal blows, trying to flatten whatever stood tall. Elias fought like a rider who had been thrown enough to learn twisting, slipping, letting weight go where it wanted, and then taking it back at the worst possible moment. A lash stung the air. One of Pike's men had a whip and knew how to use it. The leather cracked past Elias's ear, a snake that wrote pain. Elias swore and rolled boots, skidding on rime. Pike came down with the rope again, loop wide and low. Elias got an arm through it, and the jerk nearly tore his shoulder free. Ward Pike grunted, tightening the line. "You can't outmuscle what you can't outnumber." "You still have to catch it first," Elias said through his teeth. A shriek knifed the morning. Grace hit the slope like thrown thunder. She did not rear. She crashed through shoulder and chest and head in one unstoppable line. The rope went taut, then slack ripped from Pike's hands. He stumbled, caught himself, and looked up just in time to see the mare's eyes lit with a light that did not forgive. Grace struck the lariat with a forehoof, flinging it aside. She planted herself between the men and Elias' ears, flat head low, a sound boiling in her throat that made Pike's partner back away, without knowing why. Pike measured the scene in a heartbeat. The ridge, the barricades, the smoke, the herd pressed like a storm cloud, ready to drop. For the first time, his certainty wobbled, a hairline crack. Across the basin, a horn sounded. Not iron lungs. The herd moved. It started with a ripple at the front, a tossing of heads, and a shiver of flanks. Then Grace threw her cry again, long and clean. The herd answered and broke into motion, not apart but together, one tide, one mind. They hammered toward the western choke, where Pike's traps lay sprung and smoldering in the snow. Hooves churned the crust to powder. Bodies slammed brush and stakes to splinters. The sound of 100 hearts hitting the earth was a music no man could write. Elias ran along the line, waving his hat and shouting to turn the mass away from a pocket of iron he hadn't yet fouled. Tom and Harlan tugged logs aside, opening a gap at the last second. Juniper Bill fired into the air, and then into the dirt in front of 2 riders who thought better of charging a wave that could crush them into the hill. Pike's men scattered, one tumbling from a saddle as his horse panicked and went to its knees. A coil of rope unspooled uselessly under the press and disappeared like a snake, drowning in white water. Clara stood atop a stump voice, sharp as a trumpet. "Left, keep them left, don't let them bunch at the wall." Grace ran with the front rank not ahead of them, but within them, her scars, ghost, pale, her stride short, but unbroken. She was not the fastest, not the strongest, but every head around her lifted higher when she cried. She led like a stone in a sling leads by giving weight to the arc. They hit Pike's last barricade, and it burst apart, logs rolling snow geysering into a halo. The herd poured through a living river, cutting a new bed. "Go," Elias yelled, voice raw. "Run." They ran out of the bowl, up the shallow saddle onto the high, clean plain, where the horizon looked close enough to touch. Behind them, the valley shook with the confused kicks of horses that were not free, and the frustrated holler of men who had counted wrongly. Pike wasn't done. Rage steadied his hands. He turned, saw Clara on the stump, and for a flash considered a thing he'd never live down. But another cry cut him from that thought, thin, keening young. The foal. It had been kept toward the basin shelter, watched by a knot of mares and a man with a pitchfork who had only courage and the hope that courage was contagious. In the disorder of victory, the knot loosened. The foal, bright with the fire of everything new, took 2 steps toward the open. A future so large, it felt like gravity. Pike moved. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He walked like this was his craft, and this was a nail that needed hammering. The rope slid over his thumb. He measured the distance with his eyes, the way a carpenter measures a cut. Elias saw him. He saw only Pike and the foal, and a line between them that would end a story before it started. He threw himself forward, snow grabbing his ankles, lungs burning. "Pike!" he shouted. The hunter didn't look at him. He threw. Grace moved first. She wasn't supposed to be there, wasn't supposed to be anything but exhausted bone and fierce will. But the mare cut across the slope with the ragged speed of a heart that refuses last rites. She took the rope on her withers, not her neck, and the loop closed on nothing worth keeping. With a twist of her body born of every fight she'd survived, she flipped the loop and flung it back. Pike ducked. The rope kissed his cheek and drew a line of blood. He lifted the whip. Elias lifted the rifle. "Drop it," Elias said, sighting steady breath. "Flat. Leave the valley or die here." Pike's eyes were very pale when they met his. For a moment the valley stilled, not silent, never silent, but held. Snow hung in the air like breath caught in a throat. Pike read the room. The herd was gone beyond the saddle. His men were scattered and shaken. Van Dorn was somewhere shouting at ghosts. The mare at Elias's side was a scar made of flesh that would go through him if he flinched. And the man pointing steel at his heart had the look of someone who had already decided how the next minute should go. Pike lowered the whip. He stepped back, a trickle of red running down into the beard on his jaw. Then he turned and staggered away, not beaten in his own story perhaps, but done in this chapter all the same. Elias stood with the rifle long after the need for it had passed hands, finally shaking as the cold caught up to him. Clara came down from the stump and put her palm on his shoulder. "It's not over," she said, and there was no triumph in it, only honesty. But Dry Creek heard hoofbeats today. They listened together. The sound rolled from the high plain, diminishing, still immense. Silver Hollows seemed bigger without the herd, its emptiness, a new kind of music. Elias looked at Grace, who had stepped close to her foal and set her head gently along its spine. "We held the door," he said. They did the rest. By the time the fires in Silver Hollow died to ash, the story had already outrun the wind. It went down the mountain on the backs of men with chapped lips and eyes dazzled by what they'd seen. It spread across porches and into barns, was poured into tin cups in the saloon, and shouted over anvils in the forge. "They're real," someone said. "Not 5, not 10, 100, if a day. More. Like God emptied his pockets and outspilled horses." The old men who had been laughed at for their legends sat straighter. They dug through drawers for creased maps and pointed at hollows no one had taken seriously. The children in the schoolhouse drew horses that were mostly legs and sky and called them God's herd, as if the name were a handprint on a fresh fence. Dry Creek felt different. Suspicion loosened, replaced by something like pride that cost no one else their share. People who had used Elias Ward's name as a shrug now used it as a story. The saloon keeper nodded at him when he came for coffee and not whiskey. A farmer who'd once paid him half a day's wage for a full day's work shook his hand and didn't look away. On the street, women with baskets slowed and asked after the mayor as if she were kin. Clara watched it happen, a small smile finding the corner of her mouth in spite of the soot. "See," she said softly one afternoon as they mended a gate. "They finally see who you are." Elias tightened the hinge and tested it twice because some habits were faithful. "They see the herd," he said. "That's enough." Van Dorn tried denial the way a drowning man tries air. He blustered in the saloon that the valley was his grazing ground by right of proximity, that any traps found there were legal, that any mustangs remaining were unclaimed property that simply hadn't been claimed yet. But iron and rope don't lie, and neither do men who've been nearly roped themselves. Trappers who'd been hired for escort work only to find themselves at the edge of something uglier came forward in mutters. A wagon man, too old to be afraid, showed a ledger with numbers that did not look like cattle tallies. Sheriff Abel Harlow played stubborn for 3 days, then ran out of posture. The crowd at his office steps was not a mob. It was worse for a man like him. It was neighbors with questions and time. He told them he would investigate. He told them to go home. He told himself he would not be the last to know which way the town's wind blew. Elias didn't hunt Van Dorn. He didn't need to. The man found him instead at a table in the saloon where the coffee had gone cold and the room had gone quiet. "You made a fool of me," Van Dorn said in a low voice that wanted to be a threat and landed as a confession. "You did that yourself," Elias answered. Van Dorn flexed his jaw. "You think this is finished?" "It was finished," Elias said, "the day you decided living things were just property with lungs. Wild horses never belonged to anyone. You lost the moment you forgot that." Van Dorn stared at him a long time, searching for some soft spot in the words where a knife could go. He must have found none. He left without finishing the drink he hadn't ordered. No one said good riddance, but no one shifted to make him a path either. In a small town that's as loud as a bell. While the dust of reputation settled, work of another kind began. The shed on the edge of the Ward place was no longer a place for dying. Clara scrubbed its boards with lye and hot water until their grain woke up like red skin after cold. Elias lifted the roof half an inch with braces and new trust. They scavenged stall fronts from a bankrupt livery and a row of old fence rails from Harlan's back pasture. Where the wind once whistled through a broken wall, a wide door now swung true. "Haven of the Mustang," Clara said, pencil between her teeth as she lettered aboard. "It sounds like a hymn." "It sounds like a promise," Elias said. The town arrived the way towns do, piecemeal and exactly when they were needed. The prices brought oats and a sack of old tack, most of it worth more as stories than tools, but a cinch strap among them that would outlive 3 saddles. The blacksmith, Clara's father, limped up the lane with 2 lengths of iron gate across a wagon bed, and a look that said he'd been wrong about something and liked being wrong less than anyone. He bolted the gate to posts with the same tenderness most men reserve for cradles. Children traipsed down in a swarm, each clutching a board roughly cut and slapped with paint. They hammered their crooked little signs along the fence, "Home of Freedom, Run Wild, We See You." The words were wrong and perfect. Elias learned that healing is a trade you never finish learning. He learned the weight of a poultice and the patience of waiting for bone to tell you when it was done knitting. He learned how to stand near and not on a wild thing's fear until the fear backed down on its own, and the wild thing did not. Clara taught him how to bind a sprain and how to look a temper in the eye without flinching. She taught him it was all right to call a soft thing what it was. Whitaker came one morning with a roll of parchment that looked older than half the living men in the county. He set it on the table, smoothed it flat with hands that shook only when the work was easy. "My wife's land," he said simply. "She always wanted it used for something that would outlast both of us. The strip runs from the south fence to the mouth of the hollow. You keep it for the herd." Elias swallowed hard. "I don't know how to thank you. You keep the gate open," Whitaker said, and the corner of his mouth twitched like a man remembering a joke he once loved. They walked it together that afternoon, a ribbon of scrub and sage that threaded the rocky rise and slid right into the valley's secret. It wasn't just a path. It was legal proof that a line on a map could be a refuge in the world. Grace healed in the slow, honest way that the best things do. The fur over her scars never lay quite right, and her stride always kept the memory of a limp, but she carried her head the way queens do in paintings few people ever see in person. Beside her, the foal had legs like nonsense, and a sense of balance that improved daily, and then hourly, and then all at once. People came to the fence for the mare and stayed to laugh when the foal kicked at sunlight and seemed to land a blow. A girl of 7 with a ribbon in her hair pressed her face to the rails and said with complete authority, "She's the queen of Dry Creek." And because no argument rose to meet it, that's what Grace was, at least in one corner of the county, where titles were earned by endurance instead of permission. Clara leaned on the fence, watched the pair canter a clumsy circle in the yard. "We didn't just save a horse," she said. "We saved a legend." Elias didn't answer right away. He didn't have a word for the piece that had moved in behind his ribs and built a chair there. He only nodded, and when Clara's hand found his forearm, he let it stay where it wanted. Evening settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the silence that used to feel like accusation, but the contented hush of chores done and animals fed, and a town that had spent the day being decent. On one such evening, Elias stood on the porch and looked toward the red seam of the west. Far off, where the land rolled up to meet the sky, dust rose in a pale veil. It might have been wind. It might have been hooves. He decided it was both. He thought of a night when wind had tried to erase the world and nearly succeeded. He thought of a mare, half buried and half dead, who had looked him in the eye and told him without words to get up. He thought of rope burns and iron teeth and every small defiance that had conspired to carry breath across one more minute and then another. Behind him, the haven breathed the scrape of a hoof on a stall board, the sigh of a gate, and a human voice saying something kind because kindness had become the habit. In front of him, the prairie breathed back. "People will forget again," he said softly, the way a man admits both a fear and a fact. "But the herd won't." He felt Clara's presence before her hand warmed his back. "Then we'll remind them," she said, "as long as it takes." Elias let the last of the sun press a line of heat along his brow. "Hope's stubborn," he said almost to the dark. "It always finds a way back." And sometimes he knew now hope did not arrive with trumpets or wings. Sometimes it came on 4 legs with a scar around its throat and a voice that could break a valley open. Sometimes it dragged you out into the snow and made you choose who you were going to be when the wind stopped. He listened. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a rhythm gathered the far, faint drumming of a freedom that no man owned and no winter could smother. He smiled small and honest, and went back inside to check the latches on every stall, not because he feared the night, but because he finally loved the morning that would come after it.